Well, hi. Good morning. I want to spend a little bit of time working with you guys today, and hopefully trying to get, uh, some of our work done and some of our notes done before it got too late. Yesterday, I tried to upload some videos, and actually, it took me like 5 or 6 hours for the video to upload. So I'm going to try to avoid that by doing it earlier. Um, because of the delay, I also just want to let you know we're only going to have two lectures this week. Uh, and I'm glad to see those who are here today, like Isabella. I'm glad to see you and others, and Kathleen as well. So we're going to actually go over a handout that has been posted called the Scramble for Africa. The Scramble for Africa. And I'm scrambling to try to finish these notes because it looks like it's starting to sprinkle. And I have to walk up these stairs that don't have a covering. And I have this awesome school issued laptop. So I want to be really careful with that. So the first section that we're going to be talking about in the Scramble for Africa is imperialism in Africa. And the thing is that Europe had actually been involved in trade with Africa for tropical goods and slaves. That Europe and Africa have had a relationship for some time. You know, there was ivory, there was gold, there's these products that Africa and Europe were used to engaging with one another for. And so this is not a new thing that they are working together, that they are trading together. They've been doing this for some time. And so they've been working together for slaves and for tropical goods for some amount of time. In the early 1800s, the European powers declared that the importation of slaves was illegal. And so even though slavery was a big part of the trade we've talked about and we've mentioned, this was something that Europeans in the 1800s, they began to have moral objections to, and particularly the British worked to outlaw the slave trade. And so they made it illegal. In fact, the abolition of slavery was led by Britain. Great Britain was the single country that really led the way. We saw a part of a movie called Amistad in class, and there was a character in the movie Amistad who was a British officer, and he kind of testified how the British Navy sailed all around the world looking for slave fortresses and freeing slaves everywhere they went. And so now that slavery is a thing of the past, it's not that Europeans are done. It's not like that they're done with conquest. They still, or with trade with Africa, they still want to trade with Africa, but they're moving to other things. And it says that Europeans transitioned away from the slave trade and to raw materials. And that's something that they're going to be getting out of Africa. If Africa is going to not provide slaves anymore, there are other things that they're going to get out of Africa. And primarily the thing they're going to get out of Africa is raw materials. And we'll kind of talk more specifically about what kind of raw materials that is in just a bit. In fact, on this next line, we're going to talk about it. Hey, Noah. On this next line, we're going to talk about that there was 3 different raw materials that Europe turned to Africa for. And Europeans turned to Africa for gold, for ivory, and for palm oil. Gold, ivory, and palm oil. And gold, of course, that makes sense. We know all about that. We also know about ivory as well. That's a luxury item. But palm oil is not something we've talked about before. And that is something that's kind of new because that goes along with the Industrial Revolution, that all these machines, they are going to require different types of oil to help these machines function and work. And so palm oil comes from palm trees, and these are going to be grown in the tropical countries of Africa and Asia. Palm oil, in fact, was used in industrial factories. And with the Industrial Revolution, that's a new thing. And because that is a new thing, it's going to be something that is going to be used to the advantage of the Europeans. So they're going for gold, ivory, and palm oil. Palm oil was used in industrial factories. And there was also a growing demand for 2 luxury products. One is ivory, and the second one is going to be particularly found in South Africa, and that's going to be diamonds. So a couple of luxury items, ivory and diamonds. Expanding beyond trading posts. Well, for most of the 1800s, you might remember that trade was limited along the coast of Africa. If you had looked at maps, in fact, like the last map on the handout is a map that the last map on the handout is a map of like the parts of Africa that Europeans had relationships. And for the most part, white Europeans stayed on the coast. And the reason for that, we've actually discussed already before, and you should know that diseases kept Europeans from moving beyond the coast, especially the disease of malaria. Remember, malaria is that mosquito-borne disease, and Europeans realized that very quickly, as soon as they left the coast, that's when their troubles began. In fact, the word malaria comes from the Spanish malaria. They thought that it was just bad air, and they didn't realize that this was a mosquito spread disease. And the Europeans found that as soon as they left the comfort and the safety of the coast, things got bad. And that's really what kept Africa from being conquered for such a long time, diseases in particular like malaria. Well, there was two exceptions to this, two exceptions to coastal settlement. And the first was by the French. And the French had a colony in North Africa. In fact, we mentioned this in the last lecture. If you go to North Africa, if you go to France, directly south of France is the North African country of Algeria. And that is the part of Africa that the French are involved with. We'll talk a little bit more detail about them later. And the Dutch are also would work later with the British in South Africa. These are going to be two big exceptions to the hugging the coast of Africa rule. Algeria, we're going to see a large white population moving there. Not so much anymore today, but historically in the 1800s, early 1900s, and also South Africa. And there still is this high white presence in South Africa, though it is definitely not a majority by any means. So what changes this pattern? What changes white people from being limited to the coastline? Well, it says that medical advances helped Europeans overcome disease. Medical advances helped Europeans overcome disease. And so the thing is that Europeans were limited of what they could do because of disease. But as Europeans improved their medicine, they were able to overcome these challenges like malaria. In fact, quinine was an anti-malarial drug, we'll write down, that came from a South American tree, And this was something that Native Americans had used for various medicinal purposes, and they used this anti-malarial properties of this drug. And it was something that the Spanish observed. And in fact, it was used by Native Americans and observed by the Jesuits. We've talked about the Jesuits before. You might remember that the Jesuits are the smartest of the smart. They're the best of the best. They're the most educated of the Catholics. And it was the Jesuits who observed this pattern of different products that the Native Americans were using from the forest, from the natural world. And they then took that in themselves and brought that knowledge back to Europe. Other things that helped to make colonization of Africa, now that we have the mosquito problem solved, now we have the malaria problem, not solved because there's no vaccine for it, but it does help treat and reduces the chance you'll die astronomically. Before, it was really, the numbers were just too great. Over 80% of people who are white would die of malaria, and it wasn't something that was worth it for white Europeans to try to go to Africa. But now that percent of dying has reduced astronomically. Malaria is still a thing. I actually have a friend named Stephen, and he just actually had malaria just a few weeks ago. And so people still get it. It's still terrible, but with medicine, it's something that you can survive. You can survive. And so Europeans are surviving. Another thing that helped Europeans, it says, was that transportation to and in these new areas was aided by steamships. It was aided by steamships. So that's another thing, is that we have Europeans with steam-powered vessels uh, able to go to places quickly that they would not have otherwise. So let's talk about another real practical reason why the British were interested in Africa, and it has a lot to do with controlling Egypt. And there's a map on your handout showing you two different ways that you should think about getting to India. In fact, the British were interested in a faster route to India. India was considered like the jewel and the crown of the British Empire. After the British lost the 13 colonies, their attention really went to India. There's so much opportunity, so much wealth, so much money to be made in India, and they really wanted to get there as quickly as possible. The problem is, before the Suez Canal, if you look at the map, they have to go all the way around that southern tip of Africa. It's a huge trip. And after the Suez Canal, you can see that they can now go through the Mediterranean Sea, cut through Egypt, through the Red Sea, and make this shortcut to India. And that's really important because they want to conquer India, they want to control India, and they want quick, easy access to the raw materials that's there. It says they knew that they needed to build a canal. They knew that they needed to build a canal. And in 1869, the construction was completed of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal, and still one of the most important canals in the world. And what kind of difference does this make? Well, before the Suez Canal, the trip to India was 12,000 miles. Before the Suez Canal, it was a 12,000-mile trip from Britain all the way around the southern tip of Africa to India. And after the Suez Canal, the trip to India was only 7,200 miles. So it was 12,000 and went down to 7,200. That's incredible. I mean, that is almost cutting the trip in half. The Suez Canal itself was impressive. It was about 100 miles long, and it required, according to some sources, an immense labor force. The canal was built by one estimate of an Egyptian workforce of 1.5 million workers. I mean, that is quite a feat to link these huge parts of the world together. Africa, Europe, going through Africa to get to Asia. 1.5 million people worked on that canal at one point in time, and thousands sadly died. And well, after the Europeans built the canal, and there was some uncertainty if the Ottoman Empire could maintain control, if they could rule it well, the British thought, what a wonderful opportunity, what an excuse for me to invade, to protect the canal and actually just take Egypt for themselves. And that's what they did. When security of the canal was uncertain, the British took Egypt away from the Ottoman Empire. We've talked about the Ottoman Empire many times. You might remember it has a nickname. The Ottoman Empire is called the sick man of Europe because the Ottoman Empire had control of like a certain portion of Southeastern Europe. It was losing control bit by bit by bit. Parts of the empire are going off on their own, and they finally lose Egypt to the Europeans. Well, what other parts of Africa are the British interested in? They have Egypt. They've taken that as part of the British, but they're also interested in West Africa as well. One super famous example is a country called Sierra Leone in 1787. In fact, Sierra Leone's capital is called Freetown, and that's indicative of the fact that Sierra Leone was home for freed slaves. You might remember that a big theme in the 1800s is that the British got real religious-y. They got really rediscovered some of their Christian values, and the British government, leaders in the British government said that you cannot hold Christianity to be true and at the same time hold slavery. And so really the British led the way in abolition. getting rid of slavery. And so one of their colonies, Sierra Leone, was a colony meant for former slaves, and the capital was named Freetown as a reminder of that. The British also took over Nigeria, seeking access to raw materials like palm oil. And you see there's kind of like a contradiction here. There's on one hand they're like, oh well, we're Christians, we take the Bible seriously, so we cannot have slaves. That would be wrong to own people and to control them. And we're also going to invade Nigeria and take away their freedom and independence and not let them be able to vote and represent themselves. But we're Christian. So there's these conflicting interests where they say they're Christian, and because of that, they're against slavery, and they say they're Christians, but they justify how it's okay to like invade Nigeria and take it over. Some of these things don't make sense, but the British, like all of us, are people of conflicting values. So that's the British in Nigeria. They take it over so they can have access to grow palm oil. This was needed for industrial factories. So the British are doing quite well. They have Nigeria, they have West Africa. We didn't talk about it, and we're not going to talk about it in this lesson, but they did have East Africa like Kenya and Uganda and Tanzania. And they have Egypt, but they're not the only ones that are taking over parts of Africa. The French are there too. In fact, the French in Africa, the French established also a settler colony. A settler colony is a colony where we see a lot of white people moving to. There's not a lot of white people in Nigeria, not a lot of white people in Kenya or Uganda, but this is an example of a settler colony. We mentioned it at the beginning of our lesson. It's the North African country of Algeria. Algeria is an example of a settler country. And the French ruled Algeria for a couple of reasons. I mean, it just kind of makes sense. If you are in France and you go directly south, you're going to hit the North African coast of Algeria. And the French ruled there from 1830 all the way to 1962. From 1830 all the way to the 60s, the beginning of the 60s, French were controlling a colonized North Africa. And the French conquest of Algeria, sadly, is sometimes considered an example of genocide because the native Algerians at this time, overwhelmingly Muslim, wanted their freedom. They wanted their independence. They didn't want their neighbors to the north to control them. And so the Algerians, mainly a Muslim people, resisted. And the French responded with overwhelming force. In fact, we think that the French killed some estimated 825,000 native Muslims. We think they killed some 825,000 native Muslims. So just under a million of these native Algerian Muslims were killed by the French for resisting colonization. And so some have pointed to this as an early example of genocide. By 1947, so even all the way to the 1940s, right after World War II, there was a French presence in North Africa. It says by 47, there was about 7 million people, 6.85 million people there were native Muslims. So 6.85 million of the people living in Algeria were native Muslims. Those were the people that have been there for hundreds of years. They're the ones who are resisting. They're the ones who didn't want anything to do with the French colonization. They were native Muslims. But there was a good amount of white people that had been moving in from 1830 to 1962. A lot of white people had been moving from France and other places, waves upon waves upon waves of white people. In fact, some pretty impressive numbers. It says on the handout that the non-Muslim population, mainly white, of Algeria was about 1.1 million people. So we don't see those kind of numbers anywhere else. Like the British may have had like maybe a few hundred people in Nigeria. I think we talked about in lecture last time about the Germans, and the Germans had maybe a few thousand white people in German East Africa. This makes Algeria different. There is 1.1 million white people living in Algeria. And they want to make Algeria a little France. They want to transform it. They believe it's their role, their burden, their responsibility to do that. And of those 1.1 million who are not Muslim, mainly they were the religion of most of France, which was Catholic. They were mainly Catholic, but there is an important exception that even though 90% were Catholic, 10% were something else. In fact, also about 130,000 were Algerian Jews. So the thing about Algeria is that there had been Algerian Jews in Algeria since actually the first century. Jesus dies, he's arrested about the year 30 or 33. And very quickly, Christianity spreads and it takes off. We know that there was Jews in Algeria 2,000 years ago, a good sizable population. And by this time, in the early 1900s, there was up to 130,000 Algerian Jews living there. Well, some kind of challenges have happened for them. No surprise here. There's a lot of anti-Semitism in the world. It's in Europe, it's in the Americas, it's in the Muslim world. Anti-Semitism is like racism towards Jews. And as soon as Algeria got independence, you think that they would, you might think that they're going to like work with this other religious minority. Maybe they'll like say, well, we were oppressed, so we can kind of understand. But actually in 1962, when Algeria gets independence, one of the first things they do is they deny Jews citizenship. And so even though the Algerian Jews had lived in Algeria for 2,000 years, as soon as Algeria got their independence, Jews were not allowed to be citizens. So what did Jews do? They left. There was also a brand new country that was in the Middle East that was a home for Jews. The nation of Israel had been born right after World War II. And so most of the Jews of Algeria left their home of 2,000 years to move to Israel. It says by 1969, there was only 1,000 Jews living in Algeria. And by 2020, we think that there is about 50 Jews living in Algeria. So there's this mass exodus, this mass exit, this mass leaving of Jews from North Africa because they felt they were being persecuted. They felt they were being singled out. They felt that they were being blamed for working with the French. And there may be some truth to some of that, but definitely the Jews felt that they were being discriminated against. So more broadly, it looks like the French are doing relatively well. They're gobbling up Algeria. It looks like the British are doing actually great. Well, other countries want in on it as well. But they don't want to fight a war to divide up Africa. They want to divide up Africa peacefully. They want to divide it up in a way that's not going to cause any problems. And so we go down to this scramble for Africa, like a race to divide up Africa. And it says that there was a guy that you should know by name, a guy named Otto von Bismarck. He was a German leader, and he actually called for a meeting called the Berlin Conference. And it was here at the Berlin Conference that they were going to go ahead and decide the future of Africa at the Berlin Conference. Major European powers agreed to divide up Africa among themselves. They said, listen, now that we have these drugs, now that we can prevent malaria from being a killer, now that we realize that there's these raw materials in Africa that are going to help industrialization, we need to actually just get together and divide up Africa among ourselves. In this meeting, in this Berlin conference, no Africans were invited. So this meeting that's supposed to decide the future of Africa had not a single African attending. This would replace the previous relationship based on trade. They were trading with Africa for hundreds of years, and they only traded not because they didn't want to take over Africa. They wanted to take over Africa. They just couldn't take over Africa. Now the medical technology is there. Now they can. And so now they're not going to trade with Africa. They're now going to own Africa. And there was a first come, first served view of colonization. In other words, hey, if you can If you can make it to Algeria, it's yours. If you can make it to Congo, it's yours. If you make it to Kenya or Burundi or Nigeria, whoever gets there first gets to keep it. Any land not being farmed was considered vacant and available. And the thing about Africa, or parts of Africa, is there's a lot of Africa that's, it's, where wildlife live, like elephants and zebra or tropical forests, and no one is technically using it. And so when the white Europeans show up, they're like, well, there's just a bunch of rainforest here. No one's using it. No one owns it. Let's just clear cut that. Let's chop that down, or let's start farming it. And the problem is there's tribes that actually live in that land. Like in the Congo, there's tribes called the Pygmy. And the Pygmy, they are hunters and gatherers. But from the British point of view, they're not using the land. They're not doing anything with it. So it's really up for grabs. And sadly, to this day, the Pygmies are an isolated, persecuted, and looked down upon people. New European colonies drew borders that divided previously unified people groups. So the Europeans show up and they get out their pencils and their maps, they start drawing borders. And the problem with this is that the Europeans didn't know about the tribal differences. They didn't know what a Hutu and a Tutsi were. They didn't know that this is where all the Hutus lived and this is where all the Tutsis lived, or whatever the case may have been. And they actually drew lines separating people that had been together forever. And these same lines that divided people that had been together forever actually put traditional enemies together in areas they were not accustomed to living with. It says that new European colonies drew borders that unified people groups who had been traditional enemies. And so Europeans were unaware of the language, of the culture, of the rivalries. They were putting groups together who hated each other, and they were separating people who had been family for thousands of years. It says that this would lead to problems in the 20th century after independence. I should say so. In fact, there's a map, figure 1A. It shows you different ethnic groups and how that they're divided. You can see Africa is incredibly diverse, which is why most of my African friends speak 4 to 7 different languages. There's so many tribal groups. Every tribe has a culture, a language. And then if you look at figure 1B, all the blue represent tribal groups, ethnic groups that have been separated by these borders that don't have any natural sense from an African point of view, but they were drawn by white colonists, white colonials. And that is why some people say the problems we see in Africa today are partly because of these lines that were drawn, not by the African people, but by outsiders. Okay, so let's talk about South Africa, the Afrikaners, and the Boer War. So after the Napoleonic Wars, in South Africa, the British replaced the Dutch. The Dutch were actually some like the first white people to make it to South Africa. And there's a name for these people that have been in Africa for a long time, and they're called the Afrikaners. The Afrikaners were the first whites in South Africa getting there in 1657. So just think about that for a second. What if your family was an Afrikaner? What if you're white and your great-great-great-great-great-grandpa was born in South Africa in 1657? In 1657, your family showed up in South Africa, and your family has been in South Africa since 1657, from the 1600s, from the 1700s, to the 1800s, and all the 1900s. If your family's been in Africa for 300 years, 350 years or whatever, don't you have the right to say that you're African? Well, these white settlers, originally who were Dutch, say, yeah, we do, and they were called the Afrikaners. And the Afrikaners, it says they spoke their own language. Their language that they still speak to this day is called Afrikaans, which evolved in South Africa from Dutch. So it's based on Dutch. It is a language that is akin to that. And it says that the British and the Afrikaners, well, they're going to come into conflict because you have these Dutch these Dutch descendants of Dutch settlers, and then the British come in, and they're both white, but they're two different types of white people. There's another name for Afrikaners. Sometimes they're called the Boers, and it says that the British on one hand, these white British, and the Afrikaners, the Boers on the other, come into conflict with each other. They come into conflict with each other, and this series of conflicts is called the Boer Wars. These Boer Wars would see the British putting Boers even in concentration camps. In fact, sadly, in these first examples of concentration camps where you have white people putting white people in concentration camps, even targeting women and children, we see huge numbers of deaths. In fact, in these concentration camps, we see 27,000 Afrikaner deaths. 27,000 Afrikaners died. And not just Afrikaners died in these early examples of concentration camps, even Black Africans who were caught in the middle of this did as well. We think about 15,000 Black Africans died in these concentration camps. And we actually have a photo of one little girl. This is a white Afrikaner girl. Her name is Lizzie, and she died in a camp at the age of 7. And she was considered an undesirable. It turns out that her dad was fighting against the British, and because of that, she was deprived of the resources she would need to be able to fight disease and the terrible conditions in these camps. Lizzie's famous photo is just one example of 27,000 Afrikaners who died in these prison camps, many of which were women and children. And so when we think about concentration camps, you're right to think about Adolf Hitler, but listen, that started before Hitler, and it was the British who even did it to fellow whites, to these Afrikaners. So that's a picture of Lizzie, and now we know about this dark period that we don't hear enough about. Even more dark, sadly, is the events that happened in the Congo. In fact, the events of the Congo revolve around a man named King Leopold II, and he led the conquest of the Congo. This is an area in Central Africa surrounding like the most important river, the Congo River. It's a place that I hope to go to in the next year or two. And the thing about King Leopold II is he owned the Congo, this huge, massive region in Central Africa, as his personal property. Like, he claimed it as like his personal property. Like you might claim a car, your parents might claim a house. He claimed the Congo as his property. And he used and ordered brutal methods of getting the native people to work. And he made a ridiculous amount of money. We think that he made profits that would equate, in today's money, $1.1 billion. 1.1 billion with a B. Billion with a B. I mean, that's just from the endeavors he had in South Africa. And the thing is that he ordered that the local people harvest two things: rubber and palm oil. Rubber and palm oil. And he had quotas. And if people didn't get the quotas done, he actually asked that local whites who worked for him chop off the hands of the workers who were not working hard enough. Here's a picture on your handout, and it gives a description of one colonial official. It says, all blacks saw this white man as the devil of the equator. Why? What was so different about this man? Well, from all the bodies killed in the field, you had to cut off the hands. He wanted to see the number of hands cut off by each soldier who had to bring them in baskets. A village which refused to provide rubber would be completely swept clean. As a young man, I saw this soldier then guarding the village take a net, put 10 arrested natives in it, attach big stones to the net, and make it tumble into the river. Rubber causes these torments. That's why we no longer want to hear its name spoken. Soldiers made young men kill or rape their own mothers and sisters. I mean, that's pretty crazy, right? That's pretty, ridiculous that is the the situation. And this was all under the order, the knowledge, and the direction of King Leopold II. The second picture has a picture of a bunch of people, some elderly, some just kids. And there's something that they're missing in all those pictures. They're missing hands because they've been chopped off for not working enough, for not meeting the quota. It says this: the baskets of severed hands, the baskets of severed hands set down at the feet of European post commanders became a symbol of the Congo Free State. The collection of hands became an end of itself. Soldiers brought them to the stations in place of rubber. Even they went out to harvest them instead of rubber. They became kind of like currency, like money. They came to be used to make up for shortfalls in the rubber quotas, to replace the people who were demanded for the forced labor gangs. And the soldiers were paid their bonuses on the basis of how many hands they collected. So again, this is being the direction of the King of Belgium. This is what the King of Belgium wants. He is ordering the cutting off of hands for not collecting enough rubber. And some of these administrators aren't even collecting anything unless they're not even getting paid unless they bring these hands. How many people died in the Belgian Congo? How many people died in the Belgian Congo as a result of these policies of King Leopold II? Well, we're not really sure. I'm going to give you a range, and this range is pretty wide. We think at least 3 million people died. At the very least, we think 3 million people died. But at the high end, we think 10 million people died. 10 million. That's a big difference. But listen, we all know about like the Holocaust, because 6 million Jews died, and it's important we study that. But listen, how many of us before tonight knew that up to 10 million Africans in the Belgian Congo were killed, and millions more had their hands chopped off because Europeans wanted access to raw materials? I would say probably not many, probably none of us, I would imagine. Usually an AP World History course is the first time you're ever going to like learn about stuff like that. But it's important we see these pictures. We know these things. If you were shown a picture of a German Nazi concentration camp, you would know, okay, boom, I know exactly what that is. There's a Star of David, striped shirt, whatever the case may be. It's important that we know, too, about what happened and that King Leopold's legacy is understood. Well, finally, our last few minutes, there are two nations that were independent. By 1900 in Africa, there was only two independent nations. And let's talk about each one. First one, in Africa, Ethiopia is the first one. It was the oldest Christian nation. We've mentioned this many times. Ethiopia had its own Christian identity. And actually, Ethiopia had in 1895 resisted invasion by Italy. You might remember Italy was like a new empire, a new country. It had just become unified in the 1800s, and they thought, how can we be like the other cool kids? All the cool kids are building an empire. Well, we want an empire. They'd take a look at Africa's map and say, okay, well, where is areas that we can invade? And they thought, look, no one's taken over Ethiopia. And that was a mistake because Ethiopia had actually begun some modernization, some training, and Ethiopia defeated Italy. And that was an embarrassment. It was a shock to the world. How in the world could Africa, how could a black African nation be a European nation? Well, it happened and it shocked the world. This resistance was great. Sadly for them, they would get conquered right before the start of World War II, which is outside of our time period for today. The second independent nation is Liberia, which was started by former slaves from the United States, which is why it's called Liberia. These liberated slaves in the United States, there was a feeling that black people and white people could never live together in harmony. So they said there were people who said, yes, slavery is wrong. We need to free slaves and then send all those free slaves back to Africa. And actually, a lot of Black Africans, African Americans said, yeah, I don't want to live in like a white racist, the United States, send me back to Africa. And so that's what Liberia was. Liberia was supposed to be a homeland for thousands of freed slaves. And the United States, white people raised money to send these people back because they thought that they would be happier there, they'd be less discriminated against there. And a lot of Black people said, yes, get me back to Africa as soon as possible. These former slaves, when they got there, they took over from the native people, which is kind of sad that, they were liberated and they're freed and they sailed to the west coast of Africa. And one of the first things that these freed Black African Americans do is they take over from the local people who are there already. And so, that's what happens. The capital city of Liberia is called Monrovia, named after the U.S. president who backed this effort. This would be President Monroe. President Monroe. Finally, we have these images of Africa before 1880, Africa 1913. All the colors on the right represent everything but yellow represents a part of Africa that has been colonized. And you can see by 1880, pretty much none of Africa, except for Algeria with the French, except for South Africa with the Afrikaners. Other than that, none of Africa had been colonized. You see, the Ottoman Empire controls all that green on the left side, and there's a lot of small independent African kingdoms. By 1913, all of Africa is taken except for Ethiopia, which we've mentioned, and Liberia, which is an independent nation with the backing of the United States. There's some parts, a different color yellow, which represents Spain, but for the most part, two countries are the biggest winners. That's the British. They control from Egypt, almost unbroken, all the way to South Africa. And then the blue on this map is the French. And you're thinking, wow, French, that's a pretty good second place. But what makes up much of that land that the French control? The Sahara Desert. And so it's big, but then you realize, wow, the French have the Sahara Desert. And you know what the British have? And that continuous collection of land from Egypt to Uganda, they have the Nile River. And so definitely a lot of differences of Africa before 1880 and Africa after 1913, where it was mainly independent and free, and after it was colonized and controlled. We call this phrase the scramble for Africa because Europeans were scrambling to get their piece of Africa. Well, with that, we've come to a close with our time. For me, I'm going to bed. I just want to encourage all of you guys. There are assignments that have been posted, videos with each assignment. It is time to get going. It is time to look those videos up, to go onto our class team's website and look at the handouts that go with each one and just fill them out. Get credit. Let's prepare for the AP History exam. Let's stay safe. To the best of our ability, I definitely wish I could be with and see and hang out with you guys and teach you in person, but until we can, we'll just do the best that we can. So have a great evening. Stay safe. If you have questions about any grades, please email me and we'll have a private conversation about it. So look forward to hearing from you guys. I have look forward to answering any of those questions tomorrow after we all wake up. Thanks a lot. Bye.